This is Ken Rockwell with kenrockwell.com and kenrockwell.tv. Today, let's have a look at the Fujifilm X-E3 camera. What makes it pretty nifty is it's among their least expensive cameras, and it's made perfectly well. It's made out of entirely almost all metal, as are all their cameras, and the picture quality is superb. Let's take a look at some of its photographs. First, here we have a photograph, and again, I hope you're watching this in real 4K because this looks incredible in real 4K. And the only way you can get that with the Apple ecosystem, as I use, is to look at it on Chrome, on a Macintosh, through an HDMI cable to a 4K TV, or possibly on your iMacs as well, but you have to run the Chrome browser. This is a shot that shows the great way that it handles very large differences in light from light to dark. This is a sunset shot at the park at a concert, and it just has this look to it that says, I want to be there. It works well in dim light. This is a shot at ISO 5000, simply handheld, and this is also made with Fuji's least expensive 15 to 45 millimeter lens. In fact, all the sample photos I'm going to show you are made with Fuji's least expensive lenses, the 15 to 45 millimeter lens and the 50 to 230 millimeter lens. This is a shot at ISO 51200 with their cheapest plastic XC 50 to 230 millimeter lens, set to 107 millimeters. This is a concert at night, works fine. Here's another shot, again at ISO 51200. I think it looks just great. No, it's not as if I shot it with the $5,000 f2 200 millimeter lens, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is just about their least expensive camera with their very least expensive telephoto lens. Here we have a 2008 Ford Mustang Shelby GTC. Look at the colors. Look at the sharpness, especially look at the sharpness of that little deck pin there. Again, with Fuji's cheapest lens, set to 45 millimeters. Here's a Provençal piece of fabric, shot again with the 15 to 45 millimeter at 45 millimeters, wide open at f5.6. Looks super sharp. This was made with a little bit of negative exposure compensation, so I didn't lose my highlights. And then the image itself was relatively darker, of course, but then I brought it up in some software that I use called Perfectly Clear, and I have a link to that down in the description as well. With that, it brings back up all the shadows and darks, so I get a very natural-looking picture that originally did not look very good shot on any regular camera. And again, made with Fuji's cheapest 15 to 45 millimeter plastic power zoom lens. Here's another shot with the 15 to 45 millimeter. Again, this camera is so sharp, as are all cameras today. There's really no limits to what I can do with this camera, and to be honest, I've used all the more expensive Fujifilm cameras, including the GFX. I don't take any better pictures even with the 50 megapixel GFX because pixels don't matter. They all seem color and tone about the same way. So if this camera, or any of the Fujifilm cameras, gives you a look you love, then this X-E3 will do it. The X-E3 is also their lightest camera ever that has interchangeable lenses. Here's a fountain at dusk made with the 50 to 230 millimeter lens, set to 100 millimeters at f11. Looks pretty good to me. I love how it holds the highlights and the shadows, and I can make everything look great. This is a 10-second exposure at ISO 200. Last but not least, here's a shot with a 15 to 45 millimeter lens at 15 millimeters at f8 for 30 seconds, down at ISO 200. And as I pan down from the top and move on down here, you can see everything is beautifully sharp with this very inexpensive equipment that I think works great. Back to the camera. The basics are, everything is here. It's got a shutter speed dial, exposure compensation. It has a real threaded cable release, so you can use an old-fashioned cable release that you can get for $5 or $10. It works great. Power switch, these are all metal. Everything's metal. Although this lever here is plastic and the buttons are all plastic. Metal bottom. Here's your battery. There's your card. The card's a little bit of a bummer to get out because it doesn't get out easily. You see, it just flew out. That's what happens. You really can't get a finger on there to push it, and you wind up losing it. The screen doesn't swivel. Oh, heaven forbid. I use an iPhone all the time. I don't need a swiveling screen. If I want to shoot it from the side, from the top, from the bottom, I don't care. And if it saves me a couple $100, I love it. What's beautiful about this, as opposed to some of the older Fujifilm and more expensive Fujifilm cameras, is everything is now on one side, including the play button. When I'm shooting with one hand, which is usually how I shoot, I just hold it, I go, and I can control everything with that one hand. I don't have to reach over here, or like with my X-E3, reach over with the second hand to hit play. It just plays. There is no longer a four-way rear controller. You have to use this little thumb nubbin, or you can use the touchscreen. And I have a completely separate video on how you use the touchscreen to set everything you need to set. What about built-in flash? Well, there is no built-in flash as the earlier X-E1 and X-E2 had, but I'm not going to give Fuji any negative marks on that. Actually, I'm going to give them a big plus because they include for free this tiny little flash. Now notice, there's no power switch, there's no mode switch, there's nothing on this. There's no battery cover. How does it work? It's powered by your camera. It receives power from the camera. It has a great interlock. This interlock never lets it fall off. Here's how you switch it on. On, off, on, off. I love it. Even better than having to use a menu. Now I just on, off. You see that? My shooting finger. I love this little flash. This little flash is awesome. This camera goes to a 32,000th of a second with its silent electronic shutter, or you can use it the usual way with the mechanical shutter. To get long exposures, set this to time, and then using the rear dial, we're up from the high ones here. What's interesting is you can get all the way out to 15 minutes. I love this feature. There we go. It's got two control dials. There's a front dial and the rear dial. The battery charges through micro USB right over here, or they include a separate charger if you want to use that. I don't think you'd need the separate charger. It's made in China. Sorry about that, but I didn't pick the venue for manufacturing. The longest video take length at 4K is 10 minutes, and it's only 15 minutes at 1080. You can run 30 minutes, but only at 720. There's no automatic brightness control for the rear LCD, but really only Canon and iPhone do that properly. The Finder has a great little automatic brightness control. The auto ISO system is very flexible like all cameras, but you can't shift the automatically selected slowest shutter speed. And you know, the great thing about the Fuji cameras is you just set this dial to whatever you want when you're getting stuck in low light. Maybe you want to hold it at like an eighth of a second with a wide-angle lens and let auto ISO and everything else do its own work. You just grab this dial. It's something you can't do on Nikon and Canon that easily. With Nikon or Canon or any of the other cameras, Sony, you have to switch the mode, which is more finger pushes. One thing it won't do that you lose with this camera, which is so much less expensive, see if you care. Yes, it has eye recognition autofocus. That's great, but it only works in the autofocus single mode. It won't work in the continuous autofocus mode. The level, the electronic level, only works in left and right. Well, you won't get a vertical indicator. You only get this tilt indicator. That's one of the few things that you lose. There's a mic in and remote control jack, which is this little 2.5 millimeter guy here, but there's no headphone jack. This other jack is the HDMI jack. Autofocus speed is just the same as all the other Fujifilm cameras. There's no mysteries or news there. Although I did find that the autofocus areas don't make it all the way up. They go this far down, they go everywhere. You see, they go over here, but they don't go all the way up to the upper edge. They go this far, which is pretty close, but I think some of the others go a little bit further. I've never found the Fujifilm cameras good for shooting action. They're always a little bulky. They always don't really keep up. If you want to shoot sports, I wouldn't be getting a mirrorless camera unless it was a Sony. Stick with the DSLR for that. The color and tone, as you saw from my pictures, I can get vivid colors out of these, but it's more difficult for me to do that. If you're all about landscapes, I find other brands of camera are superior. For at least my crazy look, I like insane colors. But you know, I was able to get what I showed on the sample pictures with this camera, and it's just fine. Film emulation, I'm not a fan of the film simulations. You can use them if you like. I find that they don't look as good as real film does. There's no ISO dial. I think that's great because Fujifilm's ISO dials are awful because they skip a couple of settings. They'll have just an H setting or an L setting. You have to assign in some 30D menu system the ISO corresponding to the H or the L setting on the ISO dial, which means the other ISOs that you really need you can't get to. For instance, the regular ISO dial might go to 12800 and then has an H. You can set the H to be the 51,000 or 25,000. You don't want to do that. You want both of those settings there. The ISO dial skip that. The great thing about setting ISO in a menu or a quick control button is that you have all the ISOs. You don't have to futz and miss some of the ISOs that you need. In general, it's a very frustrating camera to set up unless you're very patient and talented. Look at my user and how to use guides. But the problem is it's difficult camera to figure out. The menu system is very confusing. It's just never been perfected. But the good news is once you get the menus all set and the camera's ready to go, that you just pick it up, use these controllers up here, and it shoots faster from shot to shot. Oddly, it ignores the front dial when you're making settings from the Q screen. It only responds to the rear dial, and it tends to respond backwards. If I call up my Q screen and call up, say, ISO, you notice I have to turn it left to go up, and I turn it right to go down. Maybe that's the way it's done in Japan, but I would suggest when the camera's set to English language, it works in English. These little metal dials aren't as super comfy as, say, Canon's big fat ones are on their pro cameras or Nikon's are on their pro cameras. The shutter dials may be too small. I can get it, but if you're as picky as me and shoot as many kinds of cameras as I've owned, I like that I can get it from the back and not have to lean over. The shutter dial does not rotate between A and B. Heaven forbid you have to go the long way around instead of being able to get directly between them. The tripod socket isn't centered to the lens. That makes it harder to find in the dark. The finder is very good. It's sharp, it's bright, it's got good automatic brightness control. I like this finder because the OLED is even sharper because the DSP in this camera does better processing than my X-T30. I don't know why, that's just the way it is. The OLED is just as sharp, and the optics in the eyepiece aren't quite as good. However, the actual image being presented to the screen in real time during live view is a little bit sharper on this camera. So I love it. One thing to watch out for is that the finder brightness is set by the light coming through the front of the lens, not what comes through the back. So if you're indoors and doing playback, sometimes I have to point it out a window. Honestly, point it out a window so that the brightness will increase enough to make the playback look great. The flash does work great. The only gotcha is it does take a while to recycle. It's not like a full-size external flash with a bunch of AAA batteries. So you'll take a shot, then you might have to wait a little while. For playback, there's no mysteries here. If you zoom in, which I have set to do this, I find that this is a little slow trying to get all around. I'd like it to be a little faster, and there's no way to change that. But at least we can go in all 8 directions. We can go diagonal here. That's great. Oddly, the electronic finder uses a 4x3 OLED, and so when you're playing back the images, which are usually shot in 3:2 or 1.5:1, it never fills the entire vertical space of the OLED in the viewfinder. Strange, but true. If you shoot square, as I often like to shoot, the square image will fill the vertical space of the viewfinder when you're shooting, but when you play back, it won't fill. Another core incompetency of Fujifilm is they don't format their cards properly. Sony doesn't format the cards properly either. The cards come up as untitled, which is the title that they were given when you plug them into your computer. And I find when I'm in my Macintosh Finder, and I usually have a lot of things when I've come back from a shoot, and the Fujifilm cards all come up the same as untitled, drives me nuts. I love my Nikons that'll simply come up titled Nikon D850. Each of the folders on the card hold about 1,000 images, after which the camera makes a new folder. I prefer to download with a card reader, just pop out the card. Connected via USB to my Mac and Mojave, it only shows as a device's image capture, not in my Finder. The battery percentage is hidden. Here's how to find it. You have to be in the shooting mode, so tap the shutter button. Press display back a few times so you get the data screen, and there it is, 85%. And that's about it for the Fujifilm X-E3 and what it does. It's a great camera. It's an inexpensive camera. It's lightweight. The pictures look fantastic, and I can't say enough good about it. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell, kenrockwell.com, and kenrockwell.tv.